everybody. Well, this one is long overdue. This is the Marvel Legends Amazon exclusive Spider-Man villain set of 5 figures that was released, I think, actually towards the tail end of 2022. I might be wrong on that, but certainly it's been a long time since this was on the market. And I have to hold my hands up and say I held off on this set because once I saw the initial photos, I was a little bit disappointed. And we'll get into some of the reasons why as we look at the figures later today in the video. But first off, let's take a look at this packaging. And I have to say I really love this packaging. I love these giant box sets that these Amazon exclusives come in. It is massively oversized, measuring a good 15 inches tall. And as you can see, it has this fantastic newly commissioned artwork, which is largely text-free. And I have to say, this is very striking. This is very nicely illustrated, nicely coloured, and it's a really cool image. And it's pretty unique because I don't believe any of these characters have all been together at any one time previously. And if we take a look at the side panel, we can see the headshots of the same artwork that we see on the front of the packaging along the side. They're telling us exactly which characters we get. And this is the same on both sides of the packaging. And then on the reverse of the packaging, we see those same headshots again reused with some bios of each of the characters. Now overall, the presentation here is a little bit disappointing. It's a bit bland. We can see a little bit of a Spider-Man comic book cover collage at the top there, but it's quite faded and doesn't really draw the eye. And it's quite an interesting box set that Hasbro are giving us via Amazon because these are some of the more obscure Spider-Man villains or characters in his universe, and I don't believe that virtually any of these, with the exception of Spider-Man himself, have ever had a release in the Marvel Legends line prior to now. To open the packaging, of course, there is a top folding flap, and inside you'll see the cardboard interior inlay, which is held together by several strands of cardboard, and the figures themselves are contained within rice paper. So let's start off by taking a look at the Spider-Man. Now I have to be honest, when I first heard the announcements of this set and I saw the pictures, I assumed incorrectly that this was just a re-release of the symbiote costume Spider-Man we'd seen many times before. But actually, it's a completely different figure. This has a brand new frame and a very different paint job to what we've seen previously. The first thing to point out is that this is meant to be the ultimate Spider-Man symbiote costume. So this is a complete first. This is a first time we're seeing this in the Marvel Legends line, which is really quite cool. And the body mold is much smaller. This is much more like a teenager, as Ultimate Spider-Man was, of course. And this figure has a very different feel to it. Straight up, you can see that the eyes are absolutely huge on this much smaller head, so that's actually quite striking and looks really cool. The other major thing I've got to talk about, of course, is this wonderful paint job that they've given this figure, because rather than going for a matte black, they've given him a slightly glossy feel, and it's actually a sort of metallic purple. Now, we've seen this in some Venom figures in the past, and I have to say, it works an absolute treat. I love it. I love the way it catches the light, and it just creates this much more comic book accurate feel. I just love it. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. Likewise, we can see that the spider symbol there is actually very neatly and nicely applied and painted on. It looks perfectly in proportion, and I think they've done a really good job. One thing I did want to point out is that you will notice that on the back of the hands there is no triangle or that sort of square patch where the webbing comes out of. Now I can't remember whether this is actually a really accurate detail taken from the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book serial. It's been about 20 years since I read it. So I can't remember whether that's accurate or a misfire here, but I thought I'd point it out anyway. Otherwise, this figure looks really good. In terms of articulation, he does have a ball joint at the top of the neck, allowing the head to spin all the way around. It will wobble left and right a little bit, and it will look up and down a really healthy distance, thanks to that wonderful hinge joint that we see there. Now he's got ball joints in the shoulders, of course, so the arms will lift up and out. There's a complementary bicep swivel, and there's a double joint at the elbow as well, meaning he can get that lower forearm all the way back to his head there, which is really cool stuff. And then, of course, he's got the standard pin swivel at the wrist there, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around, and of course it will also hinge forwards and backwards. Then we've got a swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to turn from side to side. And we also have that ab crunch there at the top of the chest, allowing the figure to bend forwards and backwards a really good distance in both directions actually, so that's to be commended. There's ball joints in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side, and of course there's also an upper thigh swivel as well. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, there's a double joint at the knee allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back, and speaking of the lower leg, of course there is a swivel here as well at the top of the boot, which is pretty cool. And then we have the standard ankle pivot that allows the foot to wobble from side to side and hinge forwards and backwards. In terms of accessories, he just comes with one alternate pair of hands that are outstretched and another pair of alternate thwipping hands. Sadly, there's no web effects or alternate heads or anything like that. But to be fair, the hands that we got are pretty cool. It allows for a whole range of different looks for this character, put him in different positions, whether he's fighting, thwipping, crawling. You've got a full range that you can put this character in, and I think it looks pretty cool. Even though I'm not entirely sure he should have thwipping hands at all. As I said, it's been a long time since I read the Ultimate Spider-Man storyline that this is based on, so he may well use thwipping hands there, but I thought it came out the top of the backhand as it does in the main universe. And just as a quick scale comparison, here he is standing next to the Molten Man, which is in this same set. And I just really wanted to highlight the difference in the sculpting here to show just how much smaller of frame and stature this version of Spider-Man is, because the Molten Man is a pretty much standard 6-inch Marvel Legends action figure. So you can see there's a good height differential between these two, which is pretty striking and quite cool actually. It creates a very different look for Spider-Man in this line. All in all, I have to say I've been very pleasantly surprised by this figure. I had very low expectations and it's surpassed them quite a lot, and it impressed me. I love the paint apps on this figure. I think it looks absolutely fantastic, very striking. I really like that they've actually gone for a completely different frame and they have given us the Ultimate version, because it just makes the Spider-Man a little bit different to what else we already have in the collection. And I think they've done a nice job for the most part. I'm not convinced about the thwipping hands or the white space on that should be on the back of the hand. Now I might be wrong on that and I can fully concede that point, but it doesn't feel quite right to me, and I'm also a little bit disappointed that we didn't get any other accessories. Like an alternate Peter Parker head would have been very cool, maybe some webbing effects might have been nice, but moreover I think it would have been cool if they just used some slightly different articulation. We know that there is that fantastic ball joint in the chest that they're using on a lot of Spider-Man figures now. It would have been nice to see them transfer that over here, but as it is, this is actually a really cool figure, and I have to say, yeah, it easily deserves its 4 stars. Okay, so next up we have Silvermane, the first of the serious Spider-Man villains that we've not had in the line before. Now, I think Hasbro are playing fast and loose here in terms of their representation. I think the closest version that we can say that this Silvermane is based on is from the 90s run of Web of Spider-Man, where we see this version of the costume here. I think this is going to be their justification, but as we'll see, it's an approximation only. I don't think it's quite accurate, and I think the main reason for that is that they're being a little bit cheeky in that they're reusing a lot of parts here. We can certainly see a lot of parts, certainly the arms from the recent Pretty Boy figure that we saw from the Wolverine 5-pack Amazon exclusive set, and a great many parts including the torso and the legs taken from the Ultimate Beetle from many years ago now, from this self-same line. So we can see that they've really only created a brand new head sculpt for Silvermane, and to be fair, this is actually a pretty decent sculpt. I really like the paint apps. I think they've got a really good expression. I think they caught the likeness of the character pretty well. I mean, it is basically just an old man, but I think they've done a good job, and yeah, I think it gets away with it. Now, the paint apps on the body are quite nicely done. Well, I say paint apps, there's not really much in the way of shading or anything like that at all. We do see 2 different tones of silver, and I think that works really nicely. We see the plastic lighter silver, which catches the light quite nicely, and then we see the darker painted in silver, greyer effects, I suppose, which add a little bit more detail and nuance, and I think that works really quite well. Even though it's just recycling the beetle parts, I think this looks pretty good. In terms of articulation, there's a ball joint at the top of the neck, as we saw with the Spider-Man, so the head will spin all the way around. There's virtually no give, though, when it comes to tilting from side to side, but he does also benefit from that same hinge joint, allowing the head to look up and down a really good distance. Now, he's got these giant ball joints in the shoulders there, allowing the arm to lift out. There's a swivel at the top of the bicep, and there's a double joint at the elbow, allowing that lower forearm to come back a good healthy distance. Then we have another pin swivel at the wrist, allowing the hand to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards. Although mine's a little bit stiff, trust me, it can do it once you persevere and break that joint in. Then there is the same swivel at the waist, allowing the figure to move from side to side, and of course we have the same ab crunch in the top of the chest there, allowing the figure to bend forwards and backwards. There's ball joints and hips, allowing legs to kick out to the side. There's the complementary thigh swivel at the top there as well. It means the legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and of course there is that double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back. And then finally we have the ankle pivot there at the very bottom that allows the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also pivot left and right. Looking at the accessories, Silvermane probably fares the best in this entire set. He comes with an alternate pair of gripping hands, a sort of mini blaster, and then a sort of shotgun effect blaster as well, which is pretty cool. I don't know whether these accessories are comic book accurate, but I do think they are quite fun and are very cool. They both fit into his grip nice and snugly, and he's able to get his trigger finger on the triggers in both weapons, and I think that's pretty nicely done. Sadly though, those bits and pieces are missing some nice paint apps that would really just draw out what is actually quite nice sculpting, and I believe unique pieces. I don't think I've seen these on any other Marvel Legends figures before. All in all then, I'm going to give this figure 3 stars. I'm not a huge fan of the fact that they've just kind of recycled a lot of the pieces, just given them a brand new head. I do like that he has the weapons, I think that's pretty cool, but I'm not sure how accurate this is to the comic books, and it feels a bit lazy on Hasbro's part. That said, more of a complimentary wash when it comes to paint apps would have been appreciated, and yeah, I just wish they put a little bit more effort in, but all that being said, this isn't a bad first attempt. Next up, we have one of the more obscure characters, and I have to say on paper, probably one of the most exciting figures in this set, and that is of course the Human Fly. Now, in terms of his overall look, I think they've done a really nice job of capturing the classic look of this character, and I think he looks the part. Certainly, this head sculpt is really cool. I really like that they've gone for this snarling sort of open mouth effect. I think this is really cool and very different to what else we see either in this set, but also more commonly in the Marvel Legends line. So I think this is quite striking, and he's got really strong visual. I do really love these wings, which we'll take a closer look at in a moment. But in terms of the body, again, what we really see here is a real lack of paint apps. We just have the sort of the detailing painted in, and they've used this base plastic yellow for the rest of the body, but unfortunately it's got that very rubbery texture that makes this figure vulnerable to snapping and tearing, which we'll take a look at a little bit later when we look at the articulation. But moreover, in terms of its overall presentation, a little bit disappointed that there aren't more paint apps here to really draw out the detail and make this feel a little bit more robust in terms of its depth and texture that we want to see. This feels a bit flat, unfortunately. The exception to this though are the wings, because they've done a really good job of creating this translucent effect, but also that detail painted in parts, just as we see in the comic book actually. So I think they've done a really good job with this, and I really like that it's actually articulated as well, that allow the wings to lift up and to the side, creating some different looks there. And of course they catch the light quite nicely, and this looks quite striking. Now, the articulation scheme for the Human Fly is absolutely fine. It's the way it's executed that I have problems with. Of course, he has the ball joint at the top of the head, as we've seen with the Silvermane and the Spider-Man. It's exactly the same in terms of its reach lifting up and down as well, which is all good stuff. Now, he's got the ball joints in the shoulders that allow his arms to lift up and out. Again, we have that bicep swivel, the double joint at the elbow. And as you can see here, this is where I have problems. You can see that very unsteady, that very resistant struggle that I'm having to bend that elbow. And what you see in there is the plastic beginning to tear and snap because it's far too rubbery, and that makes me feel very uncomfortable. Now, he does have the pin swivel at the wrist, of course, so the hand will rotate all the way around and it will hinge forwards and backwards, which is great to see. He has the swivel at the waist, as we've seen before, and he's got the same ab crunch as well. So again, he will bend forwards and backwards, a pretty decent range, which is really cool, and I can't fault that at all. Then of course he's got the ball joints in the hip. Now you might notice that I'm using his right leg here to lift out to the side and demo his articulation here, but the reason for that is because on the left hand side that leg joint was actually beginning to snap, and if I bent it out any further, if I was even able to move it slightly to the side, then it was going to snap off, and I could see the joint breaking inside. So very, very unhappy with this. This is not something you usually see in Marvel Legends, and I'm very disappointed to see it. Now, aside from the usual things, he does also have a swivel at the top of the boot cut, which is pretty cool, and then of course he has the ankle pivot there as well. Accessories wise, all he comes with is an additional pair of gripping hands. Now, I've got to be honest, I was tempted to give this figure 2 stars, but I'm going to give it 3. The reason I was going to give it 2 is because I had that very bad experience with that leg. I know I'll never be able to use the left leg without snapping it, which is really limiting in terms of putting this on display and quite infuriating. But I appreciate that I might have just been unlucky here. Overall though, I feel like the figure, it has all the potential to be one of the best figures in this set, and it feels like Hasbro are cutting corners. I don't know why they insist on using some of these rubbery joints sometimes for some of the Marvel Legends releases. It's really unfair. I find it really frustrating. And this figure is a classic example of that. And it's a shame because it has such potential. I love the head sculpt, I really like the wings, but the fact that they haven't put any paint wash on this figure, the fact that it just feels a bit cheap, and like I said, like corner cutting again, is quite frustrating. Okay, up next we have the Molten Man, and I can't believe we've never had a classic comic book version of the Molten Man in the Marvel Legends line up until now. And this is one of the main drivers for me picking up this set, because I really like this character and I like his look. And I have to say, they've done a really good job with this figure. I think they've really caught his likeness very well, and thankfully the Molten Man hasn't really changed his look that much in all the years that he's been in Spider-Man comic books. So this makes him pretty faithful to most versions that people will be familiar with. So I think they've done a really good job. Now, they have heavily recycled the Human Torch figure from the Fantastic Four wave a couple of years ago, and I'll take a closer look at that a little bit later. But that's not a bad thing, because this is actually a really nice sculpt that works really, really well for this figure, and I like this head sculpt as well. The only thing I'd complain about here is that I would have liked to have seen the teeth done as white, and actually have them painted in, as they have done with the eyes. Otherwise, there's not a lot of depth and texture to this figure in the sense that they haven't applied any shading, but the plastic they have sculpted him in is a very nice, slightly metallic gold, which works really well. And I should note there's two major looks for this character that have been consistent across this time. There's this more 90s look where he's smoother and much more golden, which is my personal preference because that's the one I grew up reading. But then there is also the slightly classic look where he has more flames attached to him. And to be fair to them, they have tried to account for that as well, as we'll see a little bit later when we look at the accessories. As I said, there's not an awful lot to write home about when we look at the body. This is actually a really nice body sculpt. We have seen it before, multiple times actually, but it works very well for this character, and I'm not going to criticise it for that. You will notice the flames on the hands here, as I was talking about, and again, we'll compare that a little bit later. But I think the overall sculpt and the plastic that it's sculpted in works really well for this figure. So the fact that we don't have much in the way of extra shading, doesn't matter in this case, and that's unusual for me to say that, but I think this works really quite nicely because that gold is so effective. One thing I did want to point out though is that we can see these damn rubbery joints again, and you can see how this arm has become quite warped in the packaging, which is just a little bit bent. Articulation scheme is pretty similar to the other figures we've seen so far. He's got the ball joint at the top of the head, he can wobble his head from side to side this time, which is nice to see, and of course he's got that hinge there as well, allowing a huge healthy range of motion. He has the additional butterfly wing joint at the top of the chest, and I love this. I think this works really, really well. Then he's got the ball joint at the top of the shoulder, which is great, the complementary bicep swivel, the double joint at the elbow, and of course the pin swivel at the wrist as well. Now when you're using the flame effect hand, you're going to have a little bit of resistance there in terms of bending it back, but it will go forwards a good distance. He's got the swivel at the waist, and he's got the ab crunch as well, allowing him to bend forwards and backwards a pretty decent range there as well. Then of course he's got the ball joints in the hips, allowing the legs to kick out to the side. There's the complementary thigh swivel there. The legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards. There's a double joint at the knee, and then there's also the joint at the top of the boot cut there as well, that swivel allowing that lower leg to turn from side to side. And then finally there is the ankle pivot as well. In terms of accessories, he fares quite well. He comes with an additional pair of non-flame effect fist hands, which is pretty cool, and then he has the additional flame effects, one that can go on his back and over his shoulders, and then two that can wrap around his wrists. And these combine quite nicely to create that more flame effect that we talked about earlier, that more classic look for the character, and I think it's quite effective. Now, if you have the Fantastic Four Human Torch figure that was released just a couple of years ago, then you'll recognise all of these parts. Let's put them side by side. You can see this is basically the same figure with a different paint scheme and a different head sculpt. But I have to say, that's no bad thing, because I really, really rate this sculpt very highly, and I think it looks really, really good. But not forgetting, we do have those closed fist hands as well, which have no flame effects, so you can have the more streamlined look as well, which is pretty cool. So you can have two looks for this character, which I really like and I appreciate and I think works quite well. All in all then, for me, this is a very successful figure. I'm very happy to give this 4 stars. I love the articulation scheme. I think the extras he comes with, although they're recycled, they're pretty fun and they do work. They are appropriate for this character. And I think all over, the actual look and presentation, the plastic they've used, that slight metallic gold, works really well and he's actually quite striking. So to be fair, they've done a good job here. The only criticism I would have of this figure is the fact that he doesn't have the white paint on the teeth. Otherwise, I'm very happy. And then finally today we have Razorback, probably one of the most unexpected characters or figures to have in the Marvel Legends line. Razorback was originally conceived as something of a joke character, really. So it's interesting to see him appear here. Of course, his appearances have been very obscure across the years and is probably largely forgotten in truth. But yeah, very interesting to see and quite cool. It's certainly for those collectors who really like to go into the obscure characters in their collection. And I think for the most part, they've done a pretty decent job of capturing his look from the comic books, as strange as it is. If we look at the sculpting of the head and the headpiece, it's actually quite nicely done. I do really like the tusks. I like that the detailing on the face underneath. There's a little bit of shading here and there to give it a bit more depth and texture. It's just not enough. I wish they just applied a little bit more to the rest of this headpiece, just make it really, well, really flesh it out and just give it a lot more personality. As it is, it feels a little bit flat, and it's a shame because they have made a little bit of an attempt. I just wish they'd really finished the job. I don't actually recognise the body sculpt, but I'm sure this must have been used before. This is actually quite an oversized figure, much bigger and broader than we're used to seeing in the line. I feel like it must have been used, but I can't place it. Otherwise, it's a little bit disappointing because there's really not a lot going on here. It's very flat, there's no paint apps whatsoever, and it just feels, well, a bit two-dimensional, which is a shame because the sculpting isn't bad, particularly on these boots at the bottom here, which look pretty cool. Just a slight wash running over this would have just really brought this to life a lot more. Articulation wise, he's not too clever either, unfortunately. He can't really move his head. I think there probably is a ball joint underneath there, but of course that headpiece is not allowing him to do anything with it. Thankfully you can use the ball joints in the top of the shoulder though, the complementary bicep swivel, the double joint at the elbow, and of course the pin swivel at the wrist, allowing that wrist to rotate all the way around and hinge forwards and backwards as we've seen across this video already. So that's all good stuff. He has the same swivel at the waist as well, and of course he's got the ab crunch as well, allowing him to bend forwards and backwards a pretty good distance here as well, which is nice to see. He's got the ball joint at the hips, of course, so they'll kick out to the side. There's the upper thigh swivel there. The legs will kick forwards and backwards. No surprises here. And there is a double joint at the knee, allowing the lower leg to kick back as well. He also has a swivel at the top of the boot cut there as well, which is cool. And then he's got the ankle pivot. And that, I'm afraid, is that, because there are no accessories, no alternate hands, nothing for this character, which seems a little disappointing. So I'm going to give this figure 3 stars, just because it feels very limited. And again, it's probably one of the more exciting characters in the sense that it's so unusual and so strange. And of course, he's oversized, which is cool. So he has a very cool look in the sense that he's different to anything else in your Marvel Legends collection, I can guarantee you that. But sadly, they just don't seem to have capitalised on it, and it feels very much like an afterthought, like just bare minimum effort been put into this figure, which is a real shame, because if you're going to do it right. All in all then, a pretty unusual set. I have very mixed feelings about this set, from its makeup through to the actual execution. There's multiple things, multiple highs and lows for this set, really. I think conceptually it doesn't really sit well together anyway. What is Ultimate Spider-Man doing with these classic comic book Spider-Man villains? It doesn't really make sense thematically, especially since the version of Spider-Man that fought these characters was usually in his red and blues, so this is strange to begin with. That being said, the Spider-Man is a delight. I was really taken aback. I was not expecting what we got here, and I think it's actually a really cool surprise. I think it works really nicely. I think each of the figures work quite well in their own way. way. I think there's a lot of corner cutting in this set, which is disappointing. There's a lack of effort in part, and we have seen this from some of their Amazon exclusives in the past, which feels a bit cheeky, really, because they come at quite a high price point, and they know fans want these figures. I think the real standout of this set for me is the Molten Man. I happen to be a big fan of that character anyway, and I think they've executed him really nicely. This is what I would hope to see if he was a single card release. So I think, to be fair, they've done a good job there. And, you know, I feel like the intention was there. I think these are all interesting characters in their own way, although they are slightly obscure. But I have to say, all in all, this is probably a set for die-hard collectors only, real, super strong core Spider-Man fans, or those Marvel Legends completists out there. Otherwise, I think your average Marvel Legends collector will probably pass on this set quite easily. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.